All right. Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome back from lunch. Welcome to the New Ideas Plenary. It is called New Ideas, an Intersectionality of Nuclear Policy and the Global Challenges, and I'm the host. My name is Jay Sarkar. I am a British Academy Fellow this year with Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, and I'm very grateful for all the work that has gone in to make this event a success. So it's very wonderful. I was watching from upstairs on Zoom because I have other things to do, but it has gone very well, right? So I hope you're all very happy, and we hope to continue the trend with this plenary. So when I'm not at Carnegie, I am a professor of global history in the United Kingdom at the University of Glasgow, and this accent tells you this is not from the UK. So I moved 2 years ago from Boston University, where I was an assistant prof of international relations, and I was teaching nuclear politics to my students. So as this panel suggests, the name, the intersectionality of nuclear policy, it suggests that nuclear policy connects to important global challenges like environmental degradation, climate change, health, and other forms of technology. Right? In other words, nuclear weapons and energy do not exist in a vacuum. But if you have, dealt with, basic readings of nuclear anything, you know that there is a tendency to exceptionalize the nuclear, right? So exceptionalization of knowledge and exceptionalization and over-specialization of the expertise, right? So, and as a historian, as I said, I couldn't agree more with the panel's description that, we are kind of stuck in our Cold War era thinking. Think about, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, right? At the same time, as somebody who teaches in the classroom, spends a lot of time, and my colleague Rio and Lindsay, who also does a lot of that, we know that there is this very thriving curiosity amongst our students to know how this all makes sense, right? How it all connects to other things, the bigger questions of environmental degradation, health crises like global pandemics, and fast evolving technological landscape. So that is the goal of the plenary. I think it's pretty obvious, but I'm supposed to be contextualizing it, so here it goes. So the plenary is really talking about the challenges and the opportunities of these intersections from very accomplished speakers. So I will introduce them now. I was going to do alphabetically, but I will do in the order in that you're sitting. So I'm going to start with Lindsay Rand, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford CSAC, and she's a non-resident scholar here at the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie, and her research explores technical, political, and social dynamics that influence nuclear force structure, decision-making, with a focus on emerging technologies. And then we have Rio Morimoto, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Princeton University. He's the author of Nuclear Ghosts, Atomic Livelihood in Fukushima's Gray Zone, published by University of California Press last year in 2023. He's currently researching US-Japan transnational history of disaster robots and an ethnography of decommissioning robots in coastal Fukushima. And he's also facilitator of a native undergraduate student-led project, Nuclear Princeton. It's terrific. When I was at Boston University, my students collaborated with his students. So we had a group of non-native students from Boston University and Nuclear Princeton, which is entirely a native-led project. So it's terrific. Then we have Sneha Nair, who serves as Special Assistant in National Nuclear Security Administration at US Department of Energy. In this role, she supports the Principal Deputy Administrator on a range of nuclear security, non-proliferation, and international issues. Previously, she's held positions at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C., and also elsewhere outside the US in CTBTO, Vienna, Austria, and the OPCW. We are an acronym-driven field, so I hope we're all used to this, right? OPCW, talking about exceptionalization, OPCW in The Hague in the Netherlands. So I will not spend any more time, and I'm just going to open the floor with 3 broad questions, and we're going to hear from our speakers, starting with Lindsay, followed by Rio, and then Sneha. So how does the nuclear policy, as we understand, intersect with other global challenges like climate change, public health, and emerging technologies? Second, how can international cooperation on nuclear policy be strengthened in an increasingly multipolar and geopolitically unstable world? And third, what emerging technologies present the greatest opportunities and challenges, right? And then I have more in my pocket if you want stuff to talk about. All right, Lindsay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to take a moment to thank the conference organizers for, creating a space for us to think about bringing new voices and new ideas. It doesn't take a very long literature review at all to realize that most of the theories we're working with are from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I think, as people have pointed out today, we're seeing a lot of issues trying to project those older theories onto contemporary issues. So I guess going first, I'll try to just kind of frame where I see a lot of opportunities and risks in trying to think about updating some of these theories. On the geopolitical side, when we're thinking about domestic politics, in the US, there is an opportunity because we are beginning to see a reconceptualization of what national security even means in a country where a lot of citizens don't even have basic necessities. And I think trying to conceptualize the role of defense and national security, and I hope we can carry that into the nuclear field. On the international side, as Tino mentioned, we are seeing an issue with multipolarity. Kind of people are saying it is fraying some of the foundations in international organizations and norms. But I think that's because some of the powers that helped create these international organizations are actually the ones reneging on their responsibilities. And so I think as we get a more multipolar order, that provides more impetus for these countries to be upheld to their commitments. At the same time, if we don't come up with new systems, we risk something like non-proliferation treaty waning in significance, which I do think would have pretty significant negative consequences as well. So I think there's both a risk and an opportunity there. And then I think we're seeing entirely new issues that could not have been predicted when a lot of the traditional deterrence theory came about. So I think of like space security, which Tino mentioned, and then climate change, which I think we're going to talk about more in this panel, which are issues where I believe we cannot fundamentally resolve many problems with a securitization lens, and it will require a much more cooperative security approach. And so on one hand, there's a really big opportunity where we can take that cooperative approach that we learn in those newer fields and hopefully bring it into the nuclear field. But we could risk, certain people in the military sector also trying to project the securitization lens in those fields, which could get us into bigger issues. So those are, on the geopolitics side, I think some areas of opportunities and risk. And then I personally focus more on technology. So there is a lot of hype about emerging technology. And on one hand, that's why I got into the technology side, because I thought it seemed like an area where we could bring in new ideas and maybe get traction in topics that we've had a lot of stagnancy in. But at the same time, a lot of the rhetoric now is framing technology as a competition. And I think that securitization could also then reduce the ability to cooperatively address some of the issues technology might pose, and particularly in the nuclear space. And I'm not saying everything's hype. Certainly if we could get quantum computers, they might undermine existing encryption standards. Or if we can deploy quantum sensors broadly, it might make something like submarines more vulnerable. And those would have implications for nuclear deterrence, but I don't think we're bringing in enough skill, both on the technology side and the policy side, to really interrogate those ifs. And so people are kind of running away with the assertions, and it can lead to dangerous arms racing or tech competition dynamics. So I'm really interested to learn from all of you guys, and hopefully we can talk about how to bring in lessons learned from the other fields, and try to figure out also how to, what are the new ideas, and then how do we inject them into nuclear policy?
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I had a pleasure of observing the earlier panel where people talk a lot about Japan, and I was surprised, because I just came back from Hiroshima. Like I was there on Friday with a group of students. So it was kind of interesting to see. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm not used to this type of policy space, politics and stuff like that. So things I say here might sound strange, but you can take that as a provocations, right? As somebody who is coming from different field and how we are looking at this stuff. So my research is about the failure of nuclear technology. I wrote a book about the Fukushima nuclear accident, in particular focusing on what happened in the aftermath of this stuff, and then how we still thinks the only issue of nuclear anything has to do with radiation exposure, which causes a lot of issues that I think earlier panel sort of touched on. But today, I want to talk about how not only the nuclear policy field needs to be intersectional, but also the problems that exist out in the world are intersectional as well. Mm-hmm. So, of course, like I would talk about the climate change and how Japan, even after the Fukushima accident, is one of the countries recently pledged to triple nuclear energy output at the COP, right, on 28th. Which came in surprise for the citizens. But at the same time, if you ask me, what's the best way to convince the public about the needs of nuclear energy, my answer will be just increase the electricity bill. Because that's the way that people actually experience, the energy's impact on their everyday life, right? So, if I had to say something about the earlier panel, a lot of the conversation, and I think this is very US thing, about the nuclear anything is very theoretical. As if it's an abstract object in a football field kind of stuff you can move around, and the deterrence theory is all about that. But for public, it has to be something about connecting to their everyday life. And then, if I want to talk about climate change in the context of Japan, I also have to talk about the issue of aging population. That is that the country's population is what we call hyper-aged, to the extent more than 1/3 of population, close to 1/3 of population are older than 65. And connecting issue is low birth rate. That is, there are fewer younger people and more older people. That causes labor shortage issues, right? So what's happening in Japan is that the one problem is the energy issue. Well, nuclear technology is dangerous because we had an accident, but there are not enough people to deal with. How do we deal with it? The way that Japan is trying to work with is to invest in robotics, right? Which is kind of strange because they basically said, well, we don't want immigrants coming. We would rather have machines doing the job for us. However, the state of robotics is such that, it's not really ready to be integrated into human society. Robotic companies would not like to have the liability issues of, putting the incomplete technology causing some damage to humans, right? That would destroy the company. So they found a very niche industry where they can actually train and then develop the features of robots without coexisting with humans, which is nuclear decommissioning. So what's happening in Japan is as a result of the nuclear accident, it opened up a space where human beings shouldn't be in, that are allowing Japan to actually reinvest in robotics as a place where they can do a lot of experimentations in preparation for the future applications in elder care, other type of labor issues. So when we think about the nuclear stuff, even its failure is affording some opportunities that you might not be thinking of. And then the way you can kind of see about this kind of thing is to really exercise this concept of intersectionalities, to see how things are connected, which is counterintuitive because when you study nuclear anything, the core of its technology is to split something apart, right? But here, as human beings dealing with this technology that separate things, what we can do is to think about how we can bring the connections back into the picture. And then we'll talk more about this kind of thing later. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am here to provide the government perspective, which is sometimes more commonly known as raining on the academics parade. But no, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm so glad I get to speak third, because I think that Lindsay raised an excellent point by bringing up the geopolitical environment that we're in. We are in uncertain and volatile times. We have never before had two near-peer nuclear competitors. And we face a range of intersectional challenges that Rio ranged from climate change, which poses a threat to the safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent, as well as broader existential threats to humanity, as well as new domestic risks, including to nuclear security and security threats to the nuclear enterprise as a whole. We also have the expansion of nuclear energy, which brings with it incredible opportunities, but also new challenges for non-proliferation that we've not had to deal with before. And taken together, these developments make for a very complex international environment, one that's dramatically different from the world that we lived in 30 years ago, and the world in which these different theories from the 40s and 50s that are still guiding nuclear policy today originated. And we need to consider that nuclear policy needs to adapt and adjust to the broad and evolving range of threats that face the nation, as well as the nuclear security enterprise as a whole. The challenge we face is that the nuclear field has to be prepared to deal with actions which increase the likelihood of good outcomes, while preparing for the worst possible outcomes. And to do this well, we need new ideas and new voices. We need to be prepared to confront how we identify the notion of threat. Who do we consider a threat? What do we consider a threat? And by contrast, when we develop the policies to address them, who are we focusing on protecting? In the Cold War era, understandings of great power competition are always going to be part and parcel of how nuclear policy is made. And the current strategic environment in which we sit demonstrates that that is still something that should be included, but it's not the only thing. We need to ensure adaptability to threats posed by new bad actors, as well as things like emerging technologies, disinformation, and an evolving geopolitical landscape that's never gonna go away. The change is the only constant, and we need to make sure that our national security systems and nuclear policy are able to adapt to these things. As the threat environment shifts, we also need to ensure that our policies and capabilities to counter these threats are designed to adapt to new mission requirements, rather than being retired or reinvented when the landscape shifts again and again. In practice, this means that we need to develop a flexible approach to nuclear policymaking and national security as a whole that can be employed to address a range of interdisciplinary challenges and develop interdisciplinary solutions without compromising our strategic interests. And that, to some degree, that means we need to use every tool in our toolbox. At NNSA, the mission is to anticipate tomorrow's national and nuclear security challenges and develop timely and innovative solutions to ensure a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent. But too often, tools like arms control and non-proliferation end up being positioned as the antithesis to the nuclear deterrent. The reality is these are two sides of the same coin. My personal preference is to call it two halves of the same friendship bracelet, but for some reason, the NNSA comms team won't take that on board. I don't know why. But a strong deterrent helps reduce proliferation, while a strong non-proliferation regime helps reduce the demand on our nuclear security enterprise and our resources. The nuclear deterrent is a last resort, and non-proliferation is important for making sure that that's how it stays. We also need to be working efficiently to understand how nuclear policy can be cross-cutting, especially across issue areas like the ones that my colleagues here addressed, like climate change, health policy, emerging tech, and other national security issues. Failing to consider interdisciplinary approaches will create new challenges, and these are ones that we don't necessarily need to be creating for ourselves. There are enough tough things that we have to deal with. And we also need to embrace new voices. The nuclear policy field has historically been an exclusionary space. Lindsay touched on this earlier. And while efforts to address this are underway, it's important to consider how the exclusion of marginalized groups may have influenced nuclear policymaking and how this exclusion can create strategic vulnerabilities, which I'm hoping I'll get into a little bit later. In looking ahead, the nuclear policy space needs to embrace flexibility. The world is changing at an unmatched pace, and if we are unable to use all of the resources at our disposal, all the tools in our toolbox, we're unable to adapt to the evolving security landscape and the incredible range of threats that we face. All of us as stakeholders in the nuclear field and as stakeholders in the world are going to struggle to create a safe and secure future. And I look forward to hearing your ideas. I'm sure you have all the solutions.
Fantastic. That's a great way to get us started. So thanks to all of you. So some of the key themes that I picked up, and I'm sure there'll be other themes that are going to come during the Q&A online as well as here. Some of the things that I picked up is that, there's one, it's new voices is obviously something that we have been hearing all day, right? And I think all of you have different inputs to that. Like, how can we bring new voices? What does it look like? The interdisciplinarity of it, right? Not just classroom and beltway, but also there is a historian, an anthropologist, political scientist, everything else?
Everything else.
Okay.
I do it all.
So here we go, right? We did interdisciplinary here. So what does new voices mean? And you can pick whichever theme you wanted to comment on. New voices mean to you? What does it look like in terms of actual? What does it mean? How do you make that happen? And second, the twin aspects of threat mitigation, not just security, but also like civilian, military, and everything in between. So what can we do in terms of threat mitigation through responding interdisciplinarily, and the question of adaptability, which is came up very clearly in Lindsay's point about emerging tech, robotics to stem further an anti-immigration or stem immigration, like increase anti-immigration policies through robotics. I didn't know that. I think that's fascinating. So adaptability, threat mitigation, very broadly defined, like going beyond security, definitely security, but not just that, as in not just geopolitics, but also civilian, military, and everything in between, and new voices. So pick whatever you want to, and let's have a good time.
Okay, I can take a crack at a couple of these. So it is, it's fun to sit on a panel and talk about being interdisciplinary in the nuclear field, but in DC, you learn very quickly you need to focus on something and get really good at that thing, and then sometimes you get a lot of pushback when you try to bring in new ideas. So that's why, I think something that would be good, and I'd be interested to hear what your guys' view on this has been, but it is also hard to bring in new voices, especially when the voices and ideas are not packaged in a way that people understand. But I think people have been pushing back on traditional deterrence concepts and an over-professionalization of the deterrence space, with the idea that when you make something so inaccessible for more people with different perspectives to access it and engage on a topic, then you inherently impede the ability to bring in new ideas. And I'm coming from the academic side with this hat, but it's almost like peer review. Like, you don't want to be so specialized that you're not willing to take anybody's feedback, because the purpose of peer review is to get other ideas. And I think that is the value of bringing in other fields. Like, I do want to know how climate change people think about verification or trust or cooperation. And if we come up with all these acronyms and make it so inaccessible that we can't include those voices, then that's to our own detriment and our own ability to improve our ideas. On the threat mitigation side, so like I said, I focus on the technical side, and I really wanted it to be a not interdisciplinary approach, because that would have been so much easier. When I was thinking about my dissertation, I was like, okay, well, I just want to take one new technology and do an analysis and figure out how quantum sensing will impact nuclear deterrence. But then you learn very quickly that the problems aren't single-faceted, and therefore your response can't be. So it was not just that I could just do a technical analysis to show that quantum sensing is not going to undermine deterrence. I then had to figure out what contributed to people's perceptions about that, because if you actually want to address the issue, you can't just come up with an equation, fortunately. You have to figure out where people are getting their ideas and then try to understand the social dynamics behind that. And so I think that is the value you get when you bring in those ideas, but it can be hard, and it can unpack problems you did not necessarily intend to encounter, but it brings a lot of value, so.
Yeah, I guess I also want to say something about this idea of new voices. I mean, it sounds really good, and I think all of you are probably bringing some type of new voices in the field, but at the same time, I think what we need to really think about is not coming up with new voices, but to acknowledge the fact that many of the people who have been affected by the policy haven't had voices to be able to speak, right? That is like, it might be new voices from the perspective of the people who never listened to these people, but many people have been trying to speak about their concerns, right? So I think, what I'm trying to say here is that some of us have to also think about maybe new ears, who can receive the voices that haven't been heard. So, for example, Jay mentioned about the project I work with at Princeton, with undergrads at Princeton called Nuclear Princeton. All my research members are background coming from the Native and indigenous communities who have been impacted by, one way or another, the US nuclear policies, who haven't had a chance to be able to really speak about its long-term impact, right? By doing this, I realized that, I'm sort of challenging narrative like the one that, put forward again by the, Oppenheimer film, which, also connected to the Princeton as a university. You might remember, like in the beginning of the film, there was a scene that Oppenheimer was trying to recruit Feynman. And then, the universities were there. The town was so proud of this, Princeton being featured, but Princeton has different voices, as well. So I guess, I urge you not to fall into this trap, which academia often produces to the young students, is that you have to be new, you have to be original. What you say has to be different from others, right? But I want you to be more, sort of courageous to be able to say, what I'm saying might not be new in the sense of nobody has ever said it. But it matters because it hasn't been picked up by the people who actually can make decisions about X, Y, Z, right? So I think I don't want to think of myself as a new voices, other than to say that, the perspective that I might be presenting here sound slightly different to your ears than the one that you're sort of used to hearing from, your own experience or, your work in the, policy space. So the new here, I think we want to be critical about.
I think Rio's point is a really good one about the fact that sometimes it's not so much about new voices as it is new ears, in terms of the fact that you have to think about not only who is given a platform to actually have their ideas heard, but also who's the one in the decision-making role who can actually take into account these new ideas, new perspectives, new developments, and how those sort of come together to potentially create catalysts for change. In my previous role, I worked on a project that looked at bias in nuclear security, and I think the nuclear security example is a really good one if we want to talk about an example of how not listening to new voices and not necessarily being able to adapt can create the potential for vulnerabilities. The nuclear security space has always been historically quite homogenous. You have a lot of people from similar backgrounds with similar experiences, and what I think is most crucial, very similar understandings of threat. I think that when you look at nuclear security, it's largely shaped by the post 9/11 environment. And when you think about sort of what the security space looked like there, the idea of threat was very foreign. It was the idea of they are out to get us. But you have to kind of dig into the idea of who is they and who is us, right? You have to. It is absolutely true that foreign terrorism has been and still is a concern when it comes to nuclear security, especially when you think about nuclear terrorism risks. But when you think about it solely from that perspective, you also discount the fact that there are domestic actors who are of concern. In particular, domestic violent extremist groups, far-right extremist groups, have a history of pursuing a nuclear weapon, attempting to commit acts of nuclear terrorism, and there have been a number of publicly known near misses. And I think that this threat is not sufficiently considered is largely because the policies that are in place and the people making decisions are really informed by this post 9/11 environment. And it's not that they shouldn't be. That was an incredibly scary time. It revealed a lot of vulnerabilities in our nuclear security system. But just having one idea of threat really limits the scope of what we're able to address. And realistically, what we need are more people from different backgrounds who are able to consider what different threats look like. Studies on bias show that people are less likely to consider folks with different backgrounds, with similar backgrounds to them, as threats. So if the field is mostly has white men, they're less likely to see other white men as a threat. They're more likely to see people who are unlike them as a threat. And when you look at and when you start bringing in more new perspectives, new voices, people with different backgrounds, people with different lived experiences that inform their understanding of threat, you get a much more diverse range of threats. And for nuclear security, that's a good thing. It doesn't matter whether or not you feel threatened by a particular person or a particular ideology. The idea of nuclear terrorism is scary to all of us. And we want as broad and comprehensive an understanding of threat as possible. So I want everyone to have different things that they're scared of so that we're thinking of all of them when we're sort of pulling together policy and pulling together our sort of threat assessments of the field. And I think that's a really good example of how you have to think about how biases sort of inform how policy is made, and how the existing policies need to have the flexibility to adapt to different kinds of threat. Because right now, domestic violent extremists are a major nuclear security threat, at least as far as I'm concerned. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about is that maybe, hopefully, won't always be the case. And we need to make sure that the system is able to adapt so that we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel every time when we're trying to figure out who the biggest threat is. We want to make sure that the system is adaptable enough to deal with the full range.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, all of you. So I think, Sneha, what you said is really important about this more capacious or holistic understanding of threat as who looks threatening, like we're getting into the individual level now. And so I would ask, I'd let you, a few seconds to think, and then I'm going to talk about something else. But I would like to know from you about this more holistic understanding of us versus them in the nuclear policy world, and what does that mean in terms of nuclear governance, right? Mm-hmm. The governance structures are entirely about threats from outside, whether it's essentially horizontal proliferation, the next country to go nuclear, right? Like this, what's that song? Who's next? Do your professors play that in class? No. Tom Lehrer has a song. He's a mathematician at Wellesley a long time ago, and he had the song about what I play in my class is nuclear proliferation song. It's about who's next. Like, it's really a song about nuclear weapons, right? So that is a concern. Like, that is still what drives policy, whether at the state, probably less at the DOE because it's concerned. It has this more capacious understanding of what is inside and outside. Perhaps that's a good thing, I think. So anyway, to really bring the conversation back to this understanding of us versus them, right? That has become broader, wider. What does nuclear governance mean in that context? How can that adapt ideas? So think about it. And as you do, we heard a lot about, from our panelists about newness, right? And we heard about different body parts, like we need new ears. Absolutely. And I think we also need new eyes, right? So in my neck of the woods, this is to give the panelists to think. So in my neck of the woods, I'm a historian. I deal with archives, right? So what I like to tell my students and my colleagues and the junior PhD students is that you need new eyes. You might look at new archives, like new data, because it's just got declassified. You're very excited, and then you tell the same story. That doesn't make us smarter, right? So the idea is to not put old wine in new bottles of new, somebody's talking about peer-reviewed publications, but just really have new eyes and new ways of analysis for new data. So we don't talk about the same thing over and over again, right? And the other question is, what is new to you as opposed to what is actually new in the world, right? So when we discover something for the first time, we're like, oh, this is new. I have this brilliant idea. I'm going to change the world. Yeah, that's great. No, somebody's done that already and did a bad job. Maybe you can fix it, right? So what is new? So have a clear understanding of what is new. So that's enough seconds for our panelists to think about. So whoever wants to go first.
Should I go first? Okay. I also wasn't really thinking because I was listening. I want to know what happened to the wine, but
it's in some Cold War cave in Switzerland.
I'm pretty sure that's what you're serving at the happy hour later, right?
Okay, so
Let's just hope so.
On the us versus them, I mean, I really don't like thinking about that abstraction because then I think you lose the whole idea of us being more collective. And I think something like nuclear weapons is not really an us versus them anymore. I mean, with globalization, globalized supply chain, globalized communities, like it is very, 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 very hard to imagine ever having a nuclear use that does not impact much of the world. And I think there's a lot of data coming out from Princeton on this, actually, if people are interested. So I don't even know if we can do an us versus them on that front. A really good example of this playing out, too, is climate change. So what I've been working on with a colleague from Russia is trying to map vulnerability of ICBMs in Russia and the US to climate change, not to argue that, can we come up with ways to necessarily secure these from climate change, but at what point do these become so vulnerable that neither country can fully secure them or use them in a way that makes them reliable and ready? And not to say that that's necessarily now, but at what point would it be? And so that's where I think, if you can jumble up the us versus them question enough, then hopefully you can come up with areas of mutual vulnerability where you can engage in cooperation. So I guess I spent most of my time trying to not do us versus them, but in a way, then I guess that the them is climate change, but or you can bring in new issues. I guess that's my thoughts.
I guess I'm also in the same camp. All my academic career trying to break this type of binary to operate with. I mean, I think us versus them is the part of the Cold War thinking, or even before, right, that led to the way that the world is now. So, the earlier panel, obviously there was a contrast between the US and Japan, using Hiroshima as a symbolic sort of place. But one question I like asking my students is that, do you know the country that has been bombed the most? And the students struggle a lot. And you? No. Well, I mean, that close, but I think either Kazakhstan or United States, if you count the testing, right? And then, earlier panelists sort of flipped and saying like the Hiroshima being the first bomb, but of course, Trinity being the first bomb that, many of the local communities and native communities in the area being affected, right? And, we can of course think of this using this binary of us versus them and saying like, oh, whether you're US citizens or Native Americans or the Japanese, like, they have experienced different magnitude of impacts from the nuclear weapons. But if we start thinking slightly differently, including the fallout from the, the testings and then, bombings and whatnot, we are all carrying the isotopes, right? That's been basically produced from the testings post-World War II. And I like, this indigenous novelist, Leslie Silko, who wrote a novel called Ceremony, in which she sort of talks about how the atomic bombing or the creations of the atomic bomb actually make all of us kin, right? Because thus far, we're divided by the nationality, ethnicities, and all the other categories, but the impacts from the fallout really transcended all sort of categorical differences that we believe, because biologically speaking, we all carry the traces of the collective histories of what we call nuclear age or atomic age, right? So operating from this perspective, I think allow us to do a different way of thinking. So if you start from the assumption that there's a them and us, right? Then our sort of thinking goes, oh, how can we unite these things, right? What are sort of valuable that bring us together? But if you start from the assumption that all of us are connected, then our way of analyzing stuff is how are these things or how have these things been divided, right? And I think I would encourage all of you to think when you're thinking with policy, right, about what are the things that divided this thing that can bring together. What kind of policy can we suggest to make that possible, to make us realize it yet again that we are connected to begin with, right? So I think my provocation here is that again connected to the newness, new way of hearing, seeing, or other type of sensibility to think about okay, when you see things divided, question that and ask why that happened. And I think that might be an interesting way for you to think about how my policy can make changes in the world.
Well, I think I'll be the third person who agrees that us versus them in sort of the nuclear governance, policy, cooperation perspective, I don't find it that helpful either. So we all agree on something. I think that when thinking about us versus them in that context, it can be really challenging because you sort of fall back on sort of these great power competition narratives, which I think have some real value in the current environment in which we find ourselves. But I think that that narrative can really sort of it can undermine the value of other stakeholders in the space. And I think that when it comes to sort of rethinking sort of how nuclear governance can maybe be reimagined, when it comes to thinking about how we can have cooperation in difficult times, when it comes to figuring out how we develop policy differently or create new policy, we want to make sure that we're taking into account all of the different new voices and perspectives and sort of experiences that we can to inform really positive and effective policy that is going to be sort of sustainable and relevant as far into the future as we can make it be. And I think that having a much more intersectional understanding of the world, understanding the full range of stakeholders in place. I'll say that having colleagues like academics as well as folks in NGOs be able to sort of comment on the work that, for example, NNSA is doing. We have a number of transparency initiatives with civil society colleagues where they're able to ask us questions and talk about the work that we're doing, and we get to understand the expertise that they provide while they also get to understand the work that we're doing. Having those kinds of exchanges, having those new perspectives come in allows us to do better work and allows us to be more effective on what we do as implementers from the position of government. And I think that we only get that because we're willing to look outside of us versus them. And I think it's because we're also willing to take into account sort of these new perspectives that maybe haven't had as much of a voice before. And I think we're really privileged to be in a place where we're able to start doing that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So yeah, I think we are a panel that mostly agrees on most things, right? And that's a good sign. And I think when we talk about us versus them and the problems therein, essentially we're talking about hierarchies. We're talking about hierarchies of policies, of politics, and people's lives. So somebody mentioned Kazakhstan as potentially one of the most bombed nation of the world, and United States. We're really talking about hierarchies of human lives within those nation states. Like one thing that I like to discuss with colleagues and students is that I identify the nuclear test sites and ask who lives there, and do their lives matter to those at the center. And that'll tell you a lot about the hierarchy of human lives and policies and politics. And let's get outside the P5, right? If you think about Pakistan and what they have tested, they've tested in this place called Balochistan that have been wanting to secede from Pakistan since the independence of that country, right? The test preparation is going on in China, sorry, back to P5, is in Lopnor. Where is Lopnor? It's in the Xinjiang province. Who lives there? The Uyghurs, right? So that again is a great example of intersectionality in terms of non-nuclear topics, right? Should be a CTBT or concern. It is, right, the test preps, but it is also a concern about human lives being considered dispensable because Uyghurs being considered dispensable from the view from Beijing, right? So that's a great example again. So, okay, we will now take questions because I'm sure there is a lot of ideas brewing inside your heads. We would like to listen from you. So please raise your hands, and there is a roving microphone that will facilitate your intervention. We have a hand here.
Hi, Lindsay, I have a question for you. With regard to emerging tech such as quantum computing, hypersonics, lethal autonomous weapon systems, what do you anticipate being the greatest challenge going forward with regard to nuclear risk reduction and crisis stability?
I mean, I'm a little biased in this because this is where my research led me, but so there are technologies, like I said, that if we get them, or some country gets them, it could create a big asymmetric power system where maybe one country loses its deterrent capability. I focus on the second strike, or the idea that could new technologies undermine a country's ability to theoretically retaliate if another country were to use nuclear weapons first. You don't want to envision it, but the idea is that by having a secure second strike, you prevent the first strike. So making sure countries feel and perceive that their second strike is secure and that their adversary's second strike is secure, then creates the stability where you disincentivize the first strike. So I focus a lot on, could new sensing technologies make submarines vulnerable? Submarines are really how we our main form of providing a secure second strike. But actually, the interesting turn of my research was really that, when you project out for what quantum sensing will be able to do, there's no clear one day we will have the ability to detect submarines. It's actually a lot of perception issues. And so that's why I think I've been trying to bring more sociological knowledge into my research, because trying to think about what actually makes people perceive a technology to have an effect, I think is more useful, because actually there's just in the emerging tech space so many perceptions, and there's a lot of technical people trying to say these perceptions are not real, but whether or not they're real or based on technical reality or how people find their information, they are making decisions based on these perceptions. So I've been focusing more on perception, and unfortunately, it's not a new issue. So in the 70s, people were concerned about submarine vulnerability. Technical people said that's not going to happen, and then they still reacted by building up ICBMs and more submarines. And so I think we're kind of on that cusp again. I think the second strike is really where I focus. So maybe, quantum sensing, but like I said, I think perception is really the biggest issue.
There was another person who raised their hand. Okay, we have two more, at least.
Hi, so I had a question for any panelist that wants to answer. So are there any ideas in the academic and governmental sphere on how to sort of prevent the furthering of the us versus them narrative in future generations or the general public?
On the emerging technology front, there is a new article by someone named Jeffrey Ding. I don't know, was he at MIT? I don't, not important. That says I can't remember, it was a catchy title, so I'm going to butcher it, but it's essentially the idea that we are more secure if our enemy's technology is secure. And this is not necessarily a new idea, but I think he is trying to promote this idea that was around in the 90s with cooperative threat reduction, that whilst there's a lot of pressure to compete and to develop technology as rapidly as possible and to decouple R&D so that you're not giving away secrets to someone else, and that really creates an us versus them mentality in technology development that might be good in getting slightly ahead, but then you could create an issue where either your or your adversary's technology doesn't work very well. And unfortunately, if it's not working well, it might not really, and you're in an arms racing mentality, you still might deploy it. And so he is trying to bring in the idea of, can we bring in a more cooperative lens to kind of peer review the technology development? So I guess that's one area I've seen it play out, and I tend to agree with that view. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know in the nuclear field, but this similar sort of framing of the ideology, exists throughout, right? I usually teach disaster studies, and then we often talk about the media's role in producing that kind of structure, right? And then of course, students hastily criticize the media, but also you have to consider the audience who expect that type of structure as a story that they can recognize, right? So they're at the multiple level, this structure is being reproduced. So I think it might be very hard to just try to address this issue at the level of nuclear policy, that we also have to pay attention to how this structure is what holding us together in terms of making sense of the world.
I'll say that in my current capacity, my work tends to be very high level, so I'm not tracking as closely sort of where people are, the kind of work that's being done with relation to the nuclear field specifically. However, in my personal capacity as a massive nerd, I think that there's some really interesting pieces out there that sort of get at that idea of how do we sort of problematize us versus them, and how do we start sort of, first of all, seeing the narratives where they occur, and then also working to sort of undo them where we have the power to do so. I think there's sort of two very different spaces in which I've seen really interesting work being done. One is at West Point, there's a group of academics who've been working on domestic violent extremist threats and sort of how these structures form, how these sort of organizations form and are mobile. And I think that sort of at the heart of that is sort of this is that understanding of the fact that these are not people who've historically been considered threats to national security. And the fact that we now look at them as threats is really only something that happened, at least publicly, after January 6th. And I think that the fact that the way that they're looking at it and understanding that these are structures that we haven't necessarily looked at before, these are groups that we haven't necessarily acknowledged, and the way that they are structured and organized are different and require different approaches, really has forced us to sort of think about sort of violent extremism in very new ways, that I think at the end of the day are going to make us safer. And I think that the other very different space working at actually sort of touches very closely on Rio's point about media, which is sort of algorithmic bias in how sort of search engines, media, and the world is sort of constructed in a way where the people who are sort of developing the algorithms, coding things, their biases are reflected in the products that they produce, often not intentionally, but acknowledging that bias and finding ways to mitigate it, and also understanding the potential negative impact of it, I think is a really interesting space to look at that I think has really broad implications. I mean, if you want to talk about intersectionality, what part of the world doesn't touch the internet? Like what challenge do we have that isn't connected to the internet in some way? So those are two that I find really interesting that I do in my free time.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think there was somebody else who had raised their hand there.
Hi, thank you for coming here, by the way. This question is directed to Mr. Morimoto. Given that you are an anthropologist, have a background in anthropology, how has that background helped you in your work in nuclear politics? And how has it, I guess, hurt your work in nuclear politics, given the irrationality of mutually assured destruction? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if my background in anthropology helps, other than the fact that the anthropology is a discipline, like basically anything goes. Like you can study anything, right? Because if you think about the definition of anthropology, it's like you study of humans. If it's like involving humans affairs, like then I can just say like, well, that's what I studies, and then but one thing we do it slightly different from other disciplines, perhaps, is that we take people's subjective experiences seriously, right, as a starting point. So, we can, of course, say analyze policies and objectively, look at the numbers, statistics, and all that to come to the conclusion, this is the case. We will then say like, well, but people have a different experience about this particular policy, right? So for example, the nuclear energy policy in Japan is very messy in the sense that if we pay attention to new voices, that is the younger people generation's voices, most younger generations agree with nuclear energy. However, in a democratic country, with most of the people are older, right, with voting power, they're anti-nuclear energy and they vote against, right? So in this case, democracy is creating the situation where making different for the country to be able to comfortably say like, well, let's go with nuclear. Therefore, we need some mediation like robotics to be able to say like, look, it's safer now. People are not being exposed. These machines are going inside on behalf of you, right? So that we can operate on this technology even safer than before. One of my concerns being that this type of technologies perhaps afford all of us to basically not to think about nuclear energy at all, right? Because these machines can create the distance between ourselves and the infrastructure that are basically doing the work, right? And then if I look at the history, anthropologists can also look at history as well. The way that Japan sort of accepted nuclear anything after the atomic bombing, you probably remember the Out for Peace campaigns and all that, right? So they did a series of exhibitions promoting, right, the safeties and the peaceful use of atoms, and then how we human beings can control this dangerous material. One of the most popular exhibit in Hiroshima was magic hand, or what called the arm manipulator, that afforded the space between human beings and the dangerous material. So they did the choreographies, like, Japanese choreography using this kind of stuff. And then people thought, oh my God, that's so great. Nobody has to touch this dangerous material. We might be able to control this stuff. And then public accepted the technology as well. So I think, there is an interesting balance of like us needing to expose ourselves to the technologies that we're using, but at the same time, like, for the safety of all of us, we kind of have to create a certain distance. So how are we going to negotiate the distance? And I think as an anthropologist, I can look into the personal experience and perception of what might be the optimal distance between saying like, well, this doesn't matter to me, or this matters to me, right? So I think that's the kind of work I'm trying to do by listening to people, what they have to say, regardless of all the rules and laws and policies around it.
Well, if you figure that out, that would be very helpful for AI and command and control.
I don't know, too big of a job.
Meaningful, what's meaningful?
Thank you. I guess this is sort of directed at you, Lindsay, but again, I would welcome anyone's insights, but I'm specifically interested in your perspective from a technical standpoint. I don't think that it's necessarily a secret that the U.S. is struggling from its like defense industrial base sector, like the DIB. So I'm wondering if, from your perspective, there's any specific areas or opportunities that we should be engaging the private sector in these like more technical areas, especially in a sense of, avoiding the gap and not falling behind our strategic competitors. But sort of a classic question, but I'm curious about your sort of most hopeful areas for cooperation. Thanks.
Perhaps we can take the two questions together, yeah. In the interest of time.
Hello. My question, first I want to say thank you to the panel. My question is really more, I guess, up to date with the more use of AI tools. And I just wanted to get your guys' opinions on the implementation of these AI tools within nuclear weapons and nuclear security.
Fantastic. I was just wondering, why didn't anybody talk about AI the first 30 minutes? So here we are.
Okay.
Go ahead.
On the defense industrial base, and keeping up, I think one of the reasons we're falling behind in certain areas is because we are wanting to do technologies that aren't new anymore. I mean, it is very hard for the NNSA, I mean, you know more about this than I do, to recruit people because actually nuclear physics programs are dwindling, nuclear engineering programs are dwindling because it's perceived as an older technology. And so some of that is just, at what point is nuclear becoming very old and making it hard. On the flip side, I think a big example of this is the submarine industrial base. We're really projecting that we're going to need a lot of submarines in the next 30 or 40 years. Submarines take a very long time to build. You build like one a year, maybe two. But we're projecting that we need to build 2+ a year. And the Navy now is coming up with all these new ways to get people into the submarine industrial base, including making a brewery somewhere in Virginia. And I think they did a GOT submarine. I could be wrong, but I've seen submarines everywhere. Like on subways, you'll see GOT submarines or something like that. And I actually don't disagree with that approach. I think they're trying to pull in people and retrain people, which could be good in getting people who may have felt like they didn't want to go to college right away or didn't feel like they were part of the STEM community right away and trying to re-engage them. I don't know if a brewery is really going to help, but maybe. In learning from the private sector, I think that maybe we have things we could learn from the private sector. But my view is, I think that it's kind of interesting because the defense industrial base itself is a private sector too. So it's really just a split in what kind of technologies you're investing in. On the quantum side, we've seen a lot of progress by establishing cooperative agreements with allies. So the US unrolled, the State Department, I think like 14 cooperative agreements with allies to distribute quantum development across different countries because it's such a broad research area and recognizes that certain countries might be focusing on certain type of qubits. It's like a certain, quantum processor unit. And so if we can distribute that knowledge and create reinforcing mechanisms to share tasks, then that could be a way to stay ahead. So I think that sort of cooperative agreement is going to be really useful. I mean, there's a lot of work going on in this space too, like just trying to map how R&D evolves. Yeah, I can talk with you more one-on-one if you're interested in that, because I've done a lot of network analysis for this. On the AI issue, this is why I really want to hear from you, because to me, like the biggest thing with command and control and AI is, everybody wants to say meaningful human interaction, and they really say meaningful human interaction, but I really want to know what meaningful means. Like, I think keeping a human in the loop, it can be good or bad depending on how engaged the human feels. So I think we really need to focus on, do we have any metrics for like making a meaningful interaction? Can we pull from other fields to understand? Maybe robotics is a good area to learn from, but.
Yeah, so, my research focused on like basically dismantling of the technologies. So I kind of want to see AI being utilized in that aspect of the nuclear technologies, not like the actual sort of operating and then just making decisions about whether to attack or not, but how to deal with the old technologies that needs to be dismantled, right? Like as we know, the issue of nuclear technology is not just when it's in operation, but how we're going to deal with the legacies of that technologies, where we don't even know where to put, or whether or not to send a message to 200,000 years from now. This issue of nuclear waste. So I mean, that might be the field where I see some potential of AIs to be able to generate new ideas that none of us have thought of. But then, like if we rely too much on AI and its computing power, it requires energy. So we need to bring nuclear energies or other forms of stuff, which then will impact already disproportionately affected population. So this thing goes in cycle. But I think I still have some hope in including AI in the conversations in terms of the ending of the technologies. And I'm not, knowledgeable enough to be able to say anything about command and control, that type of things and how AI might fit in. Because unfortunately, what happens in the world, as we see, is like some, country does it and others have to catch up. Or in anticipation of other countries using that stuff that you have to invest in it, right? So this is the pattern. So maybe if somebody comes up with, some AI stuff, making decisions, like the US has to respond to that, right? Whether they like it or not. So that's how much I can say.
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of AI, as with any emerging technology, lots of challenges and opportunities, and a lot of potential sort of pathways across the mission space in terms of how something like AI can be applied. But I mean, government moves slowly, and that is in part because we are cautious. We have an incredible responsibility to sort of be the stewards of the nuclear stockpile. And when we bring in new progress and new technologies, new systems, new policy, new methods, it's not something we do lightly. It's something that's considered from a lot of different angles, from a lot of different people. Anyone who is thinking about going into government, I can't wait for you to sit in an interagency meeting. If you want to hear about different perspectives, you're going to hear different perspectives. But I think that the thing that's important to keep in mind is that to some degree there's also security and obsolescence. Like when we sometimes being on the cutting edge does give a strategic advantage. And when you think about the Department of Energy and NNSA National Lab Complex, that's a really good example of that. We are doing incredible, very cool things at our national labs that, I'll be honest, I don't have enough degrees to fully understand. But I think that the work that we do there proves that like we are very interested in new technologies and sort of pushing the envelope, but we're also really thoughtful about how and when we incorporate them into the existing systems. And I think that sort of on the research and development side, we're always really excited to learn about new things, but there is always going to be an underpinning of caution, and I do think that that's for the best.
Great, thank you. We have a question there. Perhaps you can hold on to the mic. There are a few questions online, and we'll just at least have one question from online, and then we can end with you if that's okay. So this is a panel intersectionality, de-exceptionalization is our goal. So we have a non-nuclear question. Like 20 years ago, this would be not raised because this is not nuclear enough for this panel. But this is a great way to bring the conversation back to other things that are still very relevant. So we have somebody online, don't know who, asked this question about the us versus them that we talked about. And how do you see, the panelists, a role of civil society, public and private sector when it comes to finding solutions to the impact of social media on domestic violent extremism connecting to nuclear policy? Maybe I'm looking at you because you raised this question, but I think it's really a question for all the panelists. Sorry.
I mean, yeah. I'm happy to kick it off. But I think in my previous capacity, sort of looking at sort of domestic violent extremist threats to nuclear security was my bread and butter, and something that does not help you sleep at night, in case you're wondering. But I think that when you sort of think about the role of civil society, it's also really important because, like I said, new perspectives, new voices, new sort of points of view in the world are really crucial to sort of understanding what the existing system is doing right, and maybe where things can be improved. In my previous role, I was in civil society and doing work on domestic violent extremism. So I am a little biased when I say that I think that civil society and NGOs and academics and for even folks in industry, if that's how you want to define civil society, they have things to contribute because they have different perspectives they can bring in. And they also have the luxury of sort of exploring without the restrictions that sort of come in place, because when government works on particular issues, it's because we're funded to do so, and it's our responsible use of taxpayer dollars to make sure that we're working only on things that we're funded to do. And so having the opportunity to sort of have civil society broaden the aperture on the work on sort of the threats and challenges of the world that we live in, and domestic violent extremism is a good example of that space. It's really I think that it's really important, and I know that NNSA in particular really values the contribution of civil society. We have ongoing sort of civil society engagements where we're able to talk with civil society, how sort of present to them on the work that we're doing, hear from them about the questions that they have, and potentially even create sort of partnerships where we're able to know that hey, we need an expert on this particular issue, but we need someone who has a different perspective, who's not sort of sitting in the same sort of context that we're in, and being able to go to civil society as those experts, as that sort of outside voice, is really helpful, because also it helps hold us accountable for the work that we're doing. And I think that is an invaluable contribution, and one that I'm really excited that NNSA works on.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm no expert in this stuff, but thinking along the line of us versus them dualism and an issue related to that, maybe one thing that we can do is to be always mindful of the fact that, even if you're in the government talking about people, you're also the people side as well. Because we're somehow really good at playing a role. Once you're given the status and role, we start acting like, wow, they're different from us, you know, they're civil society, I'm not, you know, that kind of stuff. I think it's important to remember, because as an academic, you know, I often ask like, well, you know, your work is like publicly engaged. It's like, well, yeah, of course, because I'm part of the public, right? Like something matters to me. But I think it's easy for us to forget, like, well, I'm academic, so like we address the concern of the public, you know, as if it's a separate entity. So I think, you know, as an everyday practice that we can all be mindful of the fact that we are self-intersect in these categories that the other people have made for us. And we are, you know, I think we can challenge those things, and, you know, and I think we have to challenge those categories.
Fantastic. Perhaps we can have a last question from our audience member here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Rainbow. Thank you for speaking with us. So my question is actually inspired by the comments on industrial base, defense industrial base in the US. So my question kind of go into the nuclear industry. So US is one of the top exporters on nuclear reactors. So I wonder what's your view on the non-proliferation aspects in terms of like the nuclear workforce in the ally country. The example I'm thinking about here is Saudi Arabia. How do you kind of prevent the proliferation risk while you're trying to export the technology to a third country? Thank you.
You know, I'm sure Sneh will have things to add, but on the nuclear industry, I could be wrong, but I think that the role of the U.S. has changed dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years in our leadership in being an energy component or reactor exporter. And a lot of that comes down to regulations and the very, very strict regulations the U.S. requires for nuclear anything. And in some ways that is good because it has imparted a lot of standards onto the countries we have formed cooperative agreements with. And in some cases it has pushed us behind in exports. And I think, you know, there's a lot of lessons that we're going to carry over from that in thinking about new technologies though, because when you think about sharing standards that a country who has pretty high standards in technology security, being one of the countries people go to for that technology is good because then you are propagating your standards, and non-proliferation is certainly one of the things we consider when we make these standards. But if you become so restrictive that the technology is almost inaccessible, then countries are going to go somewhere else. And I think that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has really tried to navigate that. Even in the last 5 years, I think that's become a big issue. And that's probably why the Saudi Arabia question is coming up a lot right now, because I think the US is trying to figure out its footing in this new era where we are wanting to be able to continue to share our standards in how we protect nuclear processes and equipment. And try to show that it doesn't necessarily have to be restrictive, but that, you know, we will propagate that security. I think that's my take, but you could have an entirely different view.
I mean, I think that the way that we think about sort of export of nuclear technologies is how do we do it responsibly? I mean, one of the sort of intersectional big sort of existential threats that, like, I think a few of us have mentioned but haven't really gone in depth on is climate change. And nuclear energy is a key part of how we're going to try and address the climate crisis. And that means further expansion of nuclear technology, in particular nuclear energy, to parts of the world that haven't experienced it before. I had the privilege last year to sit in an event that the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and one of our NNSA offices hosted that looked at sort of the intersection of peaceful uses of nuclear technology and nuclear security. And it invited largely participants from G77 countries to sort of talk through this exact issue, like what is it about sort of nuclear security and non-proliferation that makes it feel like a barrier? And the reality is that a lot of it has to do, I think, more with rhetoric than it does with the actual responsibilities. Because the responsibilities that are in place are those that are international and that are governed by international norms. And realistically, the U.S. nuclear export industry is reflecting those standards because we find sort of safety, security, and safeguards to be really crucial parts of how we go about exporting existing technology and even in the development of advanced reactors. You can't have a nuclear energy infrastructure, or even really any peaceful uses infrastructure, without thinking about nuclear security first. And the reality is most of these countries are doing that. They are aware of the proliferation risks that exist with nuclear technologies. Minimizing sort of radioactive sources has been part of trying to make sure that technologies that are accessible are ones that have low proliferation risk. And that is part of how we go about it. And also different fuel types, for example, when we're developing new reactors or converting existing reactors, is part of how we do that. We do that responsibly. But the reality is that like there is a lot of risk out there when you think about proliferation concerns for nuclear technology. And I think that we are not necessarily onerous in how we go about creating it. I think what the problem is that our adversaries and competitors are willing to have much lower standards in place. And I don't think we should be defining ourselves by the lowest common denominator.
Great, fantastic. So just as we wrap up, I think nuclear industry that you raised, Rainbow, is a great question because you want to ask the question, disaggregating, what is a nuclear industry? Like, when does a company become a nuclear industry? And if you look at the history of it, these are just big companies which are part of the heavy industry. And most of these companies have survived if they have had other ways of making money. And so GE versus Westinghouse, or the ones that die, like Babcock and Wilcox. When companies don't, I'm writing a book on nuclear industry, I have to chime in. When companies don't diversify enough and they lose state subsidies, they disappear, right? And so regulation is a big concern for the industry, but the more important point historically is the absence of, or the recession of the American state from the nuclear energy sphere, which is not the case in Japan, pre-Fukushima Japan, which is not the case in France. So the two countries in the world that actually has nuclear energy, where electricity is actually running the industry, are these two countries where the state is very present in the nuclear industry and paying a lot of money. What is presence? Not just regulation, bankrolling, right? So that has stopped in the United States from the late 60s, early 70s onward. So that's something to be contended with. So I'm going to stop talking here. I'm going to thank the panelists for this wonderful intervention. And as we get ready, and thank you to the audience, I couldn't get to all the questions, but I know the chat was thriving here. I would like to request the audience member to complete the survey that is there on the QR code on your tables. There are some questions, so please do that. And please get ready for the simulation. Thank you very much.